Take one, pass it down. Great. Thank you. Okay. You're up. Go. Sorry. We'll get a picture over here.
Is this working now? Okay, excellent. Okay, so one of the absolute great privileges of serving as SABEW's president, and there are many, is the opportunity to bestow one of SABEW's highest honors.
And so if you're young and want to learn about data immersion, this is the right place for you. It's a wonderful organization. I've been involved for 10 years, I guess, and I can't say enough. It doesn't feel like it's work when you're doing something you believe in, and I think all of us share this love of profession. It's the worst job in the world except for all the others, and I've had the good fortune in a career to spend most of it abroad. So I try to give back as much as I can, particularly to younger reporters who will carry the flame forward. So it's an honor, and it's a great organization to be part of, and people like Marty Steffens and all the board members who've served over the years, and can't thank you enough.
Okay, so we have a quick housekeeping matter today. Let's see if we're going to get it up on the screen here. So as most of you know, SABEW's office is located in Phoenix at ASU and has been for a number of years. And still, SABEW, though, is incorporated technically in Illinois, from dating back to its founding. So if you could please read over the voting information and cast your vote for SABEW to reincorporate in Arizona. And certainly we're happy to answer any questions as a sidebar if you have any questions. But the link is right here, and if you don't mind casting your vote now, we'd really appreciate that. We'd get that housekeeping matter taken care of. All right, and I mentioned yesterday that we have very exciting news about our spring conference. We're going to be in Seattle, April 27th through 29th. And it's going to be a very different kind of SABEW conference, and I'm delighted to welcome AP's business editor Lisa Gibbs here to say a few words about what she has planned. She's one of the chairs of that conference, so we'd love you to mark your calendar and plan to be there.
It just shows how badly next year's conference will be planned, that I can't even get up on the stage next time. No, so I'm here to say I hope to see all of you next year for our spring conference in the wonderful city of Seattle. Mark your calendar for April 27th through 29th. Myself, I'm Lisa Gibbs, business editor of the AP, by the way, and Beth Hunt from ACBJ, along with Ann Stanley of The Street. We'll be organizing what we hope is a great program. 10 years ago, or more even, Seattle, the last time SABEW was in Seattle happened to be my first SABEW conference ever. We had Bill Gates, Elliot Spitzer, and a guy named John Kerry. I hope I can even begin to live up to that kind of programming for next April. I do know that we're really, thinking about the kinds of discussions we've heard here. It's almost pointless to even say our industry, the way we tell stories are constantly in a state of change. And we want to do everything we can to make sure that next year's program really reflects how we're reinventing storytelling, how we're reinventing the business model, and really help us do our jobs better. And I almost promise you we're going to fly some drones in Seattle. So if nothing else, come out for that. Anything else I should say about Seattle, Mr. President? All right. Anyone has any ideas? Anyone wants to volunteer? Of course, please come see me today. And great, you'll be hearing from me probably over the year. So thanks.
All right. All right. Oh, so we have 2 sessions and speed networking coming up at 1:30. Look at that. We're right on time. So we have 10 minutes for networking and visiting any of our exhibitors here today. And we'll see you at one of those breakout sessions. There's one in here. There's one over here in 308. And then we also have speed networking at the same time. So hopefully we'll see you in one of those 3. Thank you.
1, 2. If everybody will take a seat, we're about to get started. Everybody come on in. Move it in or move it out.
Thank you. Shit out of it. It was really.
So, welcome. Sorry about that. Can I say welcome again quietly to, this is the investigative panel. As I've been saying to everybody for the last day and a half, this is my favorite panel and my favorite thing I do all year, I think, because it's so much fun to talk to people who've done amazing work and, get a sense of how they've done their stories. So, let me introduce them, but actually, before I suppose I should just introduce myself for those of you who were not here last night. My name's Jane Sassine, and I run the McGraw Center for Business Journalism here. We do a bunch of stuff, but the most important stuff we do as regards this panel is I run a fellowship program that supports investigative and enterprise journalism projects on business and economic topics. So you've seen these cards around here. These are my cards. If you have a story or know somebody who's got an interesting story that needs funding and support, we give grants of up to about $15,000 to various projects and provide editorial and research support too. So please get in touch if you've got a project that we should be looking at. So with that, let me start with the far side, Jonathan Rokoff. He's the Wall Street Journal reporter specializing in the pharmaceutical industry, and he was part of a team that were finalists for the 2016 Pulitzer in Explanatory Journalism for a series of stories they did on drug pricing. It was described as a lucid explanation of how pharmaceutical companies employ secretive tactics to raise drug prices relentlessly at great cost to patients and taxpayers. And I think we've all seen a lot of coverage on that topic since then, but his series was really the first to look closely at this and talk about the issue. He worked previously at the Baltimore Sun and the Providence Journal and has done investigations into a host of other things, including Maryland's dysfunctional child welfare system and police corruption in Rhode Island's capital city. Welcome, Jonathan. And next to him is Jessica Silver Greenberg. She was also a finalist in 2016 for the Pulitzer in Investigative Reporting and won the George Polk Award as well as a SABEW Best in Business Award for a series she worked on the arbitration clauses that have become a common feature in consumer contracts. And the Pulitzer Committee described that series as a revelatory inquiry into a corporate strategy to add clauses to millions of contracts, stripping consumers and employees of their rights to challenge unfair business practices in court. She's a two-time Pulitzer finalist as well. She, in 2012, was also a finalist for the National Reporting Award for a series she did when she was at the Journal looking at questionable tactics of aggressive debt collectors. She's also a three-time Loeb Award finalist and yes, a Best in Business Award too, right? And prior to the Times, she worked at the Journal, as I mentioned, and was also at Bloomberg and Business Week, where actually we first met many, many years ago. And then next to me is Dan Wagner, who joined BuzzFeed's investigative unit in 2015. He won the 2016 Livingston Award for National Reporting, a Best in Business Award as well, and was a Loeb finalist for the mobile home trap. And that was a story he worked on jointly with the Seattle Times that examined the predatory practices and discrimination at a mobile home company owned by Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway. He previously worked at the Center for Public Integrity, which, if I understand it, that's, I think, where you really began working on the story before BuzzFeed. And he, too, is a recipient of a Polk Award, has won 2 Sigma Delta Chi honors from the Society of Professional Journalists, and is also a 3-time finalist for the Loeb Awards. So very impressive people. So my first question to you all is really basically, how did you get started on these stories? I think a lot of people, when they're trying to look and get into doing more investigative stuff, have, it's a bit of a black hole, as many of these stories are. Sort of where do these ideas come from? How do you kind of develop them? So with each of you, maybe Jonathan, if you want to start and go down the line, how did the idea for the story start?
Well, I mean, drug prices, as we all know, is a perennial topic of concern and controversy. Can you hear me?
Is your mic working? Sorry about that.
Can you hear me now? Okay, now you can? Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's really inspiring to see all this really cool work and to be recognized for ours too. Thanks. Drug prices is sort of a natural subject of inquiry. I've been covering the pharmaceutical industry for 8 years now, and I would say from day one, drug prices was always sort of one of the priority topics that I was supposed to pay attention to. But what we were trying to do was come up with stories or ways to talk about drug pricing that would sort of enrich our surface understanding of the issue, and also that were impactful. And so that was the challenge, right? It wasn't sort of sussing out that drug pricing was a concern. It was sort of finding these issues in that obvious story that would make for really impactful stories. A natural one, and one I had been working on almost since I had started the beat at the Wall Street Journal, was trying to get a drug company to let me inside and let me see how they priced a drug, because that was a little bit of a black box, right? And it took forever. And I would go up to these companies time after time and say, who would be complaining about all the controversy over drug prices, and I'd be like, well, why don't you explain how it's actually done and how you justify it? And then they'd laugh. And so the big challenge there was to find a company that was willing to sort of lift the curtain a little bit and let me inside. And we can talk later about how we did that. The other story that I was directly responsible for was about this sort of insidious tactic that was contributing quite significantly to high drug prices, but that was sort of under the radar, that not many people were really aware of, not even within the industry, what was going on. And that was that companies would be buying drugs and then jacking up the prices by hundreds of %. And that was driving a lot of increased spending on drugs, and in some cases making it difficult for patients or for the hospitals that were paying for the drugs. And to find out that story, it wasn't like I went looking for that in particular. What happened was, and what I do sort of naturally on my beat, is I'm sort of always reading analysts' reports and talking with industry sources and consultants and looking at their reports. And so what I have is all this reams of data coming in. And data is a really good launching point for a story because it's fact. You can't dispute it. You can see clear trends and patterns, which also make for good stories. And what I noticed in the data, actually a year and a half before we wound up doing the story, was that this one particular company, Valiant Pharmaceuticals, was sort of the top drug price raiser of all the companies. And so I put that in the back of my mind, and then I started casting about for what was going on. And so I would talk with people in the industry, talk with consultants, talk with analysts, talk with the payers, right? So they're sort of a really good source because they bear the brunt of the drug price increases, to try and identify what comes along. And so what slowly and fitfully, because I'm not really great at this, what sort of emerged was that they were sort of buying drugs and then very quickly jacking up the prices. And that was a great story because nobody had really done it before. And as the data had shown, it was really contributing significantly to drug price inflation.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And those are, yes, I definitely want to come back to talk about how you got inside the company, because that was a great story. But so Jessica, why don't you give us a bit of an overview first?
Sure. So in a year before we did the arbitration stories, we did my colleague Michael Corkery and I did a story. It was a pretty straightforward story, or we thought it was. It was about these efforts by a bunch of banks to kill a bill that was pending at that time in Congress that looked like it should be like a slam dunk. It had bipartisan support, and what it would have done was exempt service members, so military, big, like, politically potent group that no one wants to go against, right? It would have exempted military members from having to take claims of things like illegal foreclosures or illegal repossessions of their cars to arbitration. And it was a bill that, like, I think at the time Holly Petraeus had endorsed. It looked like there was no reason for this thing, even given a very, very fractured Congress, for it not to pass. But we started following it, and we started watching these efforts that were very quiet by credit card companies, including USAA. So, including a company that, you know, prides itself on beginning as really like a card and a product for military members, for service members. We saw them trying to kill it. So we did a story about this and those efforts, and that story ran. But in doing that story, we became very interested in what is so valuable. Why does anyone care about arbitration enough that they would kind of radically go against what could have been a very bad kind of public relations moment for them? And so from there, we started just trying to understand what arbitration was and talking to as many people as we could. And we actually thought the story, when we started the reporting process, and I can go more into this, but we thought the story was what happened. We were so fascinated by the existence of this private parallel court system where judges were picked largely by the companies, and where you could have something like an NFL case, you know, a case involving NFL cheerleaders. The judge in that case was Roger Goodall, so like the head of the NFL. So, you know, we were like, this is amazing. Right. We were like, this is crazy. And so we first thought the story was going to be this deep look at what happens in arbitration. But we realized as we were going to do that story that there was another story we had to do first, which was the real power of arbitration was that a lot of people give up before they even get there. So then we realized the story was much more about how arbitration was kind of a foil, a way of killing the class action, which is much more dangerous for companies than arbitration. So that's how it kind of got started.
Yeah. Okay, great. Daniel?
So when I started working on the mobile home story, I was at the Center for Public Integrity, which is a nonprofit investigative outfit. And we're basically working there almost on specific assignment based on what grant is funding our salaries. So we have this somewhat like limited scope of things we can do, but it's actually helpful in a way because it helps to limit your universe and help you figure out what sorts of things you can do. Now, within that, I was looking for things about how the economy had or had not progressed in the time since the financial crisis. And I was particularly interested in the people who had been completely left behind or who had not seen any of the benefits nor any of the sort of downsides of the bust, but they were not of interest. I'm from West Virginia. I'm from southern West Virginia in the coal fields, and I'd been back home, and I had heard stories about this company over and over. And people were saying that they ripped me off, and they did this and they did that, and won't you write a story? And you hear that a lot when you're an investigative reporter, and you kind of filter it out, or you kind of like maybe give it a look. But in this case, I sort of gave it a very quick look and thought, Berkshire Hathaway. Well, that could be something. And then the more I looked at it, the more I realized, well, why would Berkshire Hathaway own a company that is so small, that is such an insignificant part of its business, but which has, carries such enormous, again, reputational risks, and where it seems to be, not one problem, but a morass of problems that is widespread, that is national. And the more we began digging in, and at a certain point, which I'm happy to talk about later, I joined forces with Mike Baker at the Seattle Times, a brilliant reporter. But the more we looked at it, the more we realized this was a company that was essentially allowed to run rampant. And so there was really no end or no bottom to the sorts of malicious and problematic tactics that they were engaged in, because they're set up in a very decentralized way, which is the Berkshire tradition. So once we realized that, I think we really thought, we've got something here. Let's just see what the first story is and keep working on the other ones.
That's great. So we'll actually follow up, because the next question is, okay, so you've got this sense of this idea. There's something here. But again, these are stories by their very nature where there's not a lot of obvious sourcing or obvious places. An analyst isn't going to kind of give you a thing. how do you proceed then? Talk a little bit about sort of how you then started to develop the sourcing and the data and the research that you needed to develop the story.
Well, when you're working on social justice issues and issues involving the exploitation of poverty, as Jessica knows really well, the universe of sources that are expert is quite limited. It's a small number of people. You know who you can call. They know you can call them. That's it. And then you start to pick up anecdotes, and it's like you can go on online bulletin boards and look at these complaints and stuff, but again, it's just, it sort of becomes a laundry list of anecdotes. The thing that really cracked it open for us was when we recognized that if a person is pushed into personal bankruptcy by a mobile home loan, which is a frequent occurrence because these loans carry interest rates upwards of 15-20%, they have to, in order to try to assert some sort of creditor's rights, the company has to file a proof of claim. And the proof of claim includes the original loan documents. Once we realized that, we thought, holy crap. We just like get on Pacer and start pulling down hundreds of these things, and you see patterns. And pretty soon it's like, it's not a coincidence. There are hot spots, there are places, and then in Seattle, across the country, once I joined up with Mike had been working on HMDA data. So he had been pulling together all of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, essentially lines in the database pertaining to these mobile home loans and trying to compare them to how other companies' mobile home loans performed. And so the combination of this company's massive market dominance in certain places where they were holding 80-90% of the market for lending, which is an indication that people were being steered to finance with their own in-house lender, and the fact that we were seeing the same sorts of patterns come out in the bankruptcy at the other end of the loan when things go bad, really gave us the confidence to sort of latch on and go start talking to like local community leaders, local housing counselors, and really build it ourselves. But in this case, more than any other story I've done, there was no expertise that existed out there that I was able to rely on. I ended up getting to bring a lot of this knowledge to the experts.
That's interesting. Jonathan?
Even though sort of the genesis of my project was different, the sort of approach is actually surprisingly the same. So it started with the data, right? Like looking at getting the drug list price data for these Valiant drugs. And actually a colleague of mine had heard from, who I worked on the story with, had heard from a hospital, I think it was a hospital, who was complaining about the high prices for these drugs and how it just blown through their budget. So then I just go to there are these third-party data sources that keep list price data for drugs, and there it is. And at least for my purposes, it's really important to have, to start with the facts, because you sort of need to know what the ground is that you're walking on. And when you want to go approach a company, a big company, with what they're doing, it's good that they don't question the ground, that you're sort of we're talking on my terms now, not on yours, right? So that was one thing. The other sort of key, I thought, was just to sort of make sure, I canvassed all the people that might be affected by this to fully understand the issue. So even though I'm covering the pharmaceutical industry, I've written too many stories about the pharmaceutical industry, I don't really know much about any single topic in the kind of depth to write an authoritative article. So it's very important for me to find the people who do. Now, a lot of those people naturally don't want to be quoted in the Wall Street Journal or be known as talking to the Wall Street Journal at all. But that's fine for my information gathering purposes. So what I try to do in the course of my beat reporting is sort of develop relationships so that people feel comfortable when I have a question talking with me confidentially. Because that information that they can on-the-ground insight that they can provide is invaluable in putting these stories together. It gives them the sort of nuance and potentially impact that can distinguish sort of a run-of-the-mill daily story for something that aspires to be something much more, right? So that's how the Valiant story worked. In terms of the story getting sort of behind the curtain of how a drug company priced a drug, I think a lot of that, to be honest, and we don't often think about it in reporting, just has to do with reputation and integrity. I've been covering the pharmaceutical industry for a long time. I had covered Pfizer, the world's biggest drug company by sales, or one of the biggest by sales, for a long time. And over the course of all those different reporting experiences, I think I had built a reservoir of a good reputation and a reputation for integrity, that when they were ready to tell the story, it made them more amenable to working with me. That's not to say it wasn't challenging and difficult, and we'll get into all that along the way, but I really do think that ultimately really good investigative reporting depends on, or at least for me, depends on my integrity, my insistence on checking facts, on being fair, on getting all sides.
Yeah, that's very true. Jessica?
So there were kind of two stages of this. So we started with the idea that there was no data available about arbitration. So everything about arbitration was largely anecdotal when we started the story. Companies would talk about what a great mechanism it was for resolving consumer disputes. Consumers would talk about how terrible it was. It was like pretty typical on both sides, what you would expect. And so we were puzzling. So there are three or two really major arbitration providers, one of which shares a building with the Times. So that was pretty convenient. But on the other side of the building, away from the reporters. And there was no national requirement that they disclose the outcomes of arbitrations, the numbers of arbitrations that happen every year, or the companies that are involved, right? Or so we thought. But I started, as Daniel's talking about, kind of who has an opinion, at least in the consumer finance world. And so I was talking to someone who had prepared a hearing when he was part of I was talking to someone and he was like, oh, you should talk to this other guy who worked as a judicial, for the California judiciary. And they had done a bunch of hearings on arbitration, about 10 years ago, and hadn't gotten anywhere because the governor wouldn't sign anything into law. But what they got, they did get one thing, which was a disclosure requirement. So I called this guy in California, and he was like, no, we wrote the statute so that they don't just have to disclose what happens in arbitrations in California. They have to disclose what happens, like the outcome, the names, all of that, the plaintiff, the defendant, across the country. He was like, it's statute, I don't remember the statute. I think it was like 120.86. So he's like, so they're required by law to do this if they have operations in California. Well, there's only two major companies that provide arbitration services, so they all had operations in California. So I called them and asked them for their data, and they were like, no, we don't have to disclose that. What are you talking about? And who are you? And you can come have like an informational interview with us, which of course is not remotely what I wanted. So I then called them back and just played kind of dumb, right? I was like, no, I'm sure that I'm sure that this is on your website somewhere. So I went, instead of going through the communications people, I just tried to reach policy people, and I was like, I'm sure it's on your website somewhere, because under 120.86, you have to disclose this by law. So I'm just an idiot, I clearly just can't find it. And so eventually, after multiple of these calls, which some of them had our general counsel on them, they gave me the data. And it was 25,000 records. But that in and of itself is interesting, because all along companies had been saying, no, we don't need class actions because arbitration is a perfectly great way of resolving disputes. But if you look at something like Sprint, right, so we could look by company name. So Sprint has 17 million customers, I'm estimating. They had 20 arbitrations over a 5-year period. So clearly arbitration wasn't an alternative to class actions. And so then like Jonathan, what you're saying, I've covered banks and consumer finance companies for close to a decade. So I called the people at American Express and I was like, I'm working on a story about arbitration. And they were like, oh yeah, no, it's great. Arbitration is great. And then it was like watching the stages of grief, because I'd say well, okay, that's great, but we have all the arbitration data, and you guys have only had 14 arbitrations in 2 years, and you have 30 million customers. So that seems strange to me. And they were like, oh, well, there's a lot of, it's because we resolve a lot of things pre-dispute, before they ever go to arbitration. So I said, fine, that's awesome. Can you provide that information to me? Well, no, that's proprietary. And I was like, okay. So what we're going to say is this is how many class actions you derailed because of arbitration. And then we're going to show how many arbitrations you had. And then they called, and then they were like, oh, well, we don't need any of it because we have regulators, and regulators are the ones who are policing us. And you know, like any of you, if you've covered a company, you know that if they're telling you they don't need, something because they're regulated, it's like already,
Yeah.
It's like, so I was like, okay, send me a statement. So then they sent me a statement being like, we are heavily regulated.
That's what we're really happy with it.
And I was like, great, that's awesome. So that's how we got the data.
Yeah. And Daniel, what data you had? There was I think in the story, a line that kind of caught my eye, which basically it says usually public financial disclosures about loan down payments, delinquencies, defaults, and foreclosures, are publicly disclosed, but because Clayton and the other companies were subsidiaries or owned by Berkshire Hathaway, none of this was being publicly disclosed. So how did you go about getting some of the data?
One of the fascinating things about Clayton in particular, which is very specific to this company, but it also has helped this company to get away with what it does for so long. They operate as a unit of Berkshire Hathaway. Under most circumstances, dealing with a consumer finance company that's publicly traded, you would have a lot of information about loan performance because it's what they do. It's how they make their money, and how can an investor make an informed decision if they don't have all these material facts. However, the standard for materiality, as a lot of you probably know in terms of securities law, is whether it would affect the decision of a reasonable investor to invest in that company. So once you're dealing with a company on the order of a Berkshire Hathaway, almost nothing is material, virtually nothing. And so what we had with Clayton was once it was acquired by Berkshire, there were like random little pieces of data that were disclosed each year, but they were not apples to apples by any means. It was like, this year we're going to say, like, this is our running delinquency rate because it's low, and then the next year we're going to say, like, well, we only have 2% default rate, but they don't say whether it's an annual default rate or a cumulative default rate. So in fact, their cumulative default rate is probably north of 30%, but they're able to disclose this annual 2%. So I had to go through about 15 years of quarterlies and press releases and annuals and pull every single data point that was available on Clayton into my own spreadsheet, because they don't have to, because they have bigger insurance companies and other ways of making money, which again begs the question, why own Clayton?
Presumably it made them a lot of money.
Well, it makes them a decent amount of money, but how much money do they need? I guess they make more money on other things.
Yeah.
You would think that the cost of hiring crisis comms and stuff would sort of turn them off to it, but he's a very stubborn man. Yeah.
So when you're cobbling together these databases of your own or data from lots of places and whatnot, and Jessica, I think in your story you talked about you also went and looked at lawsuits all across the country and whatnot. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you organize that and how you track it so that, Jonathan, as you said, so that you can kind of actually start to see patterns? I mean, it sounds like in your case, it was a clear database that it was perhaps not quite as difficult, but can each of you talk a little bit about kind of how is you're acquiring all this information? And I think at least certainly in the case of the two of you guys did like 7 or 8 part series, so presumably tons of information. How do you organize that as you're going along through your reporting so that you don't flip out at the end? Jonathan, why don't you start?
So if I could just take a step back for a second. So when you have these complicated stories, I find the best way to tell them is through specifics, right? Because we're not writing like a political science treatise. We're not trying to speak to some specialized academic audience. We want the story to live through the example. And so the key is to find a specific example. In some cases, it will be a character, like a Hollywood movie going through these ups and downs, right? For drug pricing, it's a company that is pricing a specific drug at a specific price, right? For the other story, it was a company engaged in this tactic of jacking up prices after buying the drug, sort of undermining the industry's argument that the reason why they price drugs as high as they do is because research and development is so expensive. And so if you have this sort of overarching story in mind, that allows you to organize the data and your thoughts in a specific way. and sort of reinforcing the story, the example that is going to tell the story. And so what I try and do, and I didn't face the obstacles building databases that you guys did, but I did have spreadsheets and lots of data, and I mean, my task was far less than you guys, but so what I'm trying to do is sort of think in terms of this sort of guiding principle through the story, and to find, well, two things actually, to find the evidence that speaks to this guiding principle, but also to look for evidence that undermines it. Because one thing that I think is really, really important in doing investigative reporting, explanatory reporting, beat reporting, whatever, is to always sort of test your hypotheses.
That's a really
right?
good point, yeah.
Yeah. And you can find yourself in a lot of trouble if you don't. And in fact, one of the reasons why I think it's really important to have a relationship with whoever you're reporting on, even if it's a strained relationship, is just to make sure before the story comes out that everything you're planning on reporting is being tested. So what I'm doing is going through, spreadsheets on drug pricing data to make sure we're seeing this trend that we're supposed to. And what I'm doing is going to the hospital to make sure that the hospital is actually not just complaining about the high cost of these drugs, but is actually feeling it in their budgets. And what I'm trying to do with Pfizer's story about how they price the drug is find people who talk to Pfizer about how they should price the drug and see if their sort of recollection matches up with Pfizer's. So it's this sort of constant process that is organized around the sort of hypothesis.
Okay. Jessica?
So there were two kind of data beasts to deal with. The arbitration data itself, that I got it, right? I got it in spreadsheets and PDFs and all this stuff to make it really challenging for us to go through. But at that point, I would have been completely lost. But I have this incredible colleague named Rob Gebeloff, and he is a computer assistant. It's such a weird title, computer assisted reporters, because we're all assisted by computers, but he actually knows how to analyze the data with various programs. He knows programming language like SQL and things like that. He built for me, so he came over to my desk one day. I'd gotten him the data maybe a week prior. And again, it was 25,000 documents, and more than that, there was arbitration. There was a lot of stuff. And he comes kind of over to my desk, and he's like, click on this. I sent you a link. So I'm doing a bad nerd impression, but he knows, I love him. So he comes over, and he's like, click on this, and I click on a link. And he's built me this thing where I can look. It's an internal website, and I can plug in a company name, and I can see how many arbitrations they've had. I can see what the outcomes were. I can see who the arbitrators were. I can see the lawyers on the cases, if there were lawyers. Most of the times there weren't. And I just stood up. I was so overwhelmed and so thrilled that I stood up and gave him a hug, and he was like, oh, this is nothing. I mean, I built a fantasy baseball site like this. I mean, and I was like, yeah, okay.
That was something really important.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the arbitration stuff. And so it was much easier to use it and to know what we were looking for after he'd built this lookup for me. With the class actions, we decided to build a universe for ourselves. So to understand, we wanted to see what the power of arbitration was. And the only way we could see that was to see how many class actions it had kind of derailed or quashed entirely. So we first had to come up with a definition of what we were calling a class action. Did it have to be certified, or did it just have to assert itself that it was a class action? So we decided it had to be certified. So that narrowed our universe. And then we used Westlaw and put this together. But one of the things, Jonathan, that you said which struck me is it is really important both to test your hypotheses, but also to make sure that you're asking the most interesting questions of your data. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that was really helpful was there are academics that have been studying arbitration and alternative dispute resolution for decades, and they're much better suited to kind of know what an interesting question would be. So I asked them from the beginning, if you had this data in a hypothetical perfect world where you had this data, or you knew kind of or you were doing a story about arbitration, what would you want to know? If you had all the manpower in the world and you had all the time, I mean, what I'm not telling them is like the manpower is me and my, like on my couch watching bad television shows and like typing things into Pacer. And so I would ask them what they would ask for from the data, and that actually helped drive some of our reporting, because people kept saying the same thing, which was, I would want to know, how many class actions were killed.
Yeah. And is that how the answers you got from them? Yeah. How did that actually change what you did, or how you then approached the story?
Well, I decided that, because I kept saying, like, isn't there another thing is, I often find with these stories that the most obvious question is one that hasn't been answered yet. So like a basic thing. So I would ask people, okay, I'm looking for analysis of how many class actions have been killed by arbitration clauses. And everyone would say, well, we don't know that. Like, no one's looked at that. So when you hear that, then you know that that's exactly what you have to do.
Yeah.
So it really did shape the story. It turned into the first story.
Yeah. Okay.
And Rob really was the driving force behind that, because he wrote a program to help us figure out.
Or get that information out of the data. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Daniel, so you're massive information.
I will sound like a total Luddite compared to the two of them. Now, one more shout out to Mike Baker out in Seattle. He had been hacking away at this HMDA data for over a month before we even joined forces. So it was in pretty good shape, and we had some interesting questions to ask. In fact, the second major story we did, which was about racial discrimination by this company, grew out of one of his earliest insights, which was that the disparity in what people were being charged by this company was much greater than for other companies. So other companies might charge people of color this much more. Vanderbilt, the Clayton company, was charging people that much more. Mike was handling the HMDA, so I didn't even have to touch it. I didn't have to look. I once tried to load it onto my computer, which resulted in me getting a nicer computer. But that was about the long and short of it. But as far as project organization and getting to the point where you write and you don't freak the F out, I mean, I believe strongly in OneNote or Evernote or something, whatever works for you, a publicly available tool that allows you to organize your ideas into notebooks and embed different forms of media. I think without that, I would feel totally lost. I use Document Cloud to mark stuff up and to share folders with colleagues. This is also very simple, very publicly available. And I found, for the first time, in working with Mike all the way across the country and going through these drafts word by word, painstakingly, with so many editors involved, I just fell in love with Google Docs in a way that I hadn't before. I always kind of hated Google Docs, but to be able to say, hey, I have an idea, what if we do it this way, and sort of type it in, and your guy across the country who's sitting at his desk at midnight sipping whiskey, and you're sitting, like, you can just sort of see it and hash it out and like get it done. It was all these very sort of mainstream tools, and I think that when it came to things like these bankruptcy filings and the proofs of claim, like the challenge ended up being sort of, well, you have a folder full of PDFs. What are you going to do with them? And what we ended up doing with them was hand transcribing them into a Google sheet. And then, for the first story, although we didn't have, we had statistical data on what the HMDA indicated, but we didn't have like here's what's going on everywhere according to comprehensive data. Instead, we said, here is a review of 200 loan files. And we thought this is a adequate starting point for a first story on a series where we're going to dig deeper. But what we really wanted to do was not allow that to become an obstacle to our telling the story that we knew to be true.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk then a little bit about how you develop sources then. Obviously, as you're starting and you're acquiring a lot of data. But the hard part in these things is often also just getting people to really talk about, whether it's victims and finding them or people from the inside who kind of know what's going on. And Jonathan, you talked about, and it's an amazing story, that the one that's really about how you got inside the company and how to do that. So maybe, again, why don't you start and talk about that, and then if there are other issues or other sourcing roadblocks you ran into or developed in the process of your stories.
So one of the things that, as I've been doing this more and more, that I've realized is really helpful, at least for me, is to be really upfront in the beginning about what I need to do a story. And the reason is because sometimes there's this, in this situation, where there's sort of general agreement between Pfizer and me that we want to do this story, it can bog down because we have different expectations for what the story should be. And so in the course of sort of our conversations about whether to do the story and what it would look like, I was very clear that I needed to get inside. I wasn't going to be talking to the spokesperson about how they did it. I wanted to talk with the people who actually did it. Now, the challenge was, when you're a large company like Pfizer, you have a lot of people who are never allowed to talk to the media and have never talked to the media. And you know, a lot of these people, they're involved in pricing a drug. They would never let them talk to the media. So they had to work that stuff out internally. And before I was going to go ahead and do a story, I had to make sure that they were willing to do that. Now, that's not to say once we started the interviews in a windowless, small room with poor ventilation that everything went really well. It didn't. Those were tense. These were folks who hadn't dealt with the media before, who had sort of endured years of criticism about drug pricing, which was their life's work, and were unsure about what they should and should not say. And so one of the sort of things that any reporter has to do is sort of learn to establish a rapport quickly, right? And there's sort of a lot of techniques for doing it. I sort of cut my teeth as a night cops reporter, so I'd have to go to like murder scenes, you know, at like 9 o'clock at night and get like gang members to tell me what happened. And the sort of lessons that I learned from that is to just be, one, to listen, and two, be myself. And I think people, when they see that you're listening and being yourself, tend to open up. People are social, right? And they're proud of what they do, and they want to talk about what they do. And so we were sitting in this small, windowless room with a lack of ventilation, and I let people talk. And I took notes furiously, and my hand was really aching. And I knew that a lot of it was never going to be in the story. But in terms of getting people to open up to the degree that then they would then talk about the stuff that really mattered for the story, that was really, really helpful.
Yeah, the extent to which people are really proud of what they do is, I think you're completely right about that. It factored in a lot to the arbitration reporting. So towards the beginning, actually in the middle of the reporting, when we started to realize that the story was not only what happens in arbitration, but the kind of machinations and the brilliance of creating a clause that could kill the class action, I started hearing about someone who called himself the king of arbitration, the father or the king, something like that, some like patriarchal thing. Anyway, so I hear about this guy, and I arranged to go meet with him. This man, Alan Kaplinsky, who ends up being a big character in the story, because he's the one that, as a securities lawyer, you know, back in the 1980s, saw this scourge, what he would describe as a scourge of class actions that were really pummeling his clients, and he tried to figure out a way to get rid of them. And he was really, really proud of what he did. So when I went to visit him the first time in his offices, I didn't understand exactly how proud he was, but I could tell he was thought he had done something incredible, which made me even more curious, right? Because I was like, okay, so this must have taken a lot of kind of legal brilliance in order to do this. So then I went back, and I think this, in terms of credibility with him, what I did was I took there were two major Supreme Court cases that this man, Alan Kaplinsky, believes he and a cadre of other lawyers really helped to catalyze. And these cases enshrined arbitration. So I started with the first case, and I learned to do what's called shepherdizing. My boyfriend is a lawyer, so I feel very bad for him, but basically he taught me how to learn. You look at one case, and then you see what precedents that case built on, and then you look at the precedent that case built on, and you go through. And so once I realized that these decisions, that Alan Kaplinsky had every right to be really proud of these, because they had overturned 2 decades of jurisprudence. They had overturned really fundamental rights in the Constitution. I went back to him and I was like, wow, I am just totally floored by what you've done. I don't support it, but I really am impressed, frankly. You're like a he was like, I am Darth Vader. That's what he said. And because of that, because I learned enough of the law to impress him, or to just like provide him with some recognition that I knew how kind of brilliant what he had done was. That really helped him to open up. So that was very important.
That's interesting, particularly given. I mean, did you actually say openly to him that you didn't agree with what he'd done?
Yes. So at the yes, I did that from the beginning, and I think that's very important.
Yeah.
It's just like the being very clear at the outset. And he said to me, and then when the story, so we put together the story. So I told him that at the beginning. Then I met with him like dozens of times, and then at the end, before the stories ran, I called him and I was like, Alan, just to tell you again, like, you're not coming off as great in these stories. Like, you look like the man who has figured out how to kill class actions. And, I'm a New York Times reporter. Like, our readers are not going to think that's the greatest thing in the world. And he was like, are you kidding? Like, I know. He's like, when you came into my office, he's like, you're basically a communist. I mean, which I'm not. But he was like, I knew that I wasn't. You've told me that from the beginning. Like, and he was. So there was no surprise. And he actually invited me to his son's wedding, which I feel like is a real testament. I didn't go because I don't think we're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
I think I'd get in trouble. But anyway, I've thought that was a good thing, that he like still takes my calls.
Yeah, that's great. And
So
Daniel?
we dealt with a series of different sourcing challenges in my project that were different from anything I've done before, because I have dealt with sourcing companies and trying to get in the door and in these kinds of things in the past. But with this one, you had an extremely backwards company that was, for all intents and purposes, a private company that had no obligation to speak to anybody. And then you had people who were victims who were literally the most dispossessed people in the universe. I mean, this was like, Native American people who had had their tribal distribution payments taken away by this company, and poor black people in southern Louisiana who have been flooded by hurricanes and had their FEMA checks taken. I mean, like, these are not necessarily folks who are going to talk to you. And so I learned a lot from this. First of all, Clayton Homes, I, from the get-go was reaching out to them, reaching out to Berkshire, leaving messages, nothing. Finally, my first trip to Tennessee, I said, well, I know you said you're really busy, but I'm just going to show up and see if you might have 5 minutes just to sit down. And it's just the marketing person, which is their version of a PR. But I thought that at least, having some human contact. And I went there and I waited for 4 hours in their waiting room. And she came down with these two enormous men. And they sat me down in this teeny tiny cubicle behind their main reception desk, which is where they put the irate borrowers. When they're like, beating them down for payments, and said like, okay, well, what is it you want to talk about? I said, well, I want to talk about the experiences that these borrowers have told me about. And they said, oh, we're not here to answer your questions. And I thought, okay, asked and answered. Moving on. We're not going to be talking to Clayton about this. And so then it was like, okay, we can talk to the victims, but we're not sure who. Go knock on the doors. And what I learned was, some of these populations are really open to talking about, the ways in which they've been screwed over, and have been screwed over for centuries by various entities, and really think that you might help. And that was my experience in Louisiana with the African American people that we talked to. But when Mike Baker went out to Indian country, to the Navajo reservation, he couldn't get a soul to talk to him at first. And then we sort of redoubled and we went back and talked to, some friends of ours who are Native American activists, and they said, oh, well, your body language is all wrong. You can't actually look someone who's older than you in the eye and introduce yourself to them and expect them to take that as a sign of respect. You glimpse at the eyes and you look back down at your feet. And what do you know? But these things really worked. I mean, cultural sensitivity played an enormous role that we didn't even think about in advance. So with the victims, it was a matter. And I hate this word victims. It's like the people who have been hurt by this company. It was a matter of really spending time. And then comes in my current editor, Mark Schufs, who will shout it out during his acceptance speech. There, Mark is really inspiring as an editor. And one of the things that he teaches us to believe is that anything is possible. That you can bring a story back and think you've done everything under the sun and tried everything and shaken every tree. And he's like, where's your smoking gun? You know, where is the memo that says we now intend to discriminate against racial minorities? And you know, of course, the memo doesn't exist, and it never will in this day and age. But the lesson that I took from it was, you know, Dan, I know this is going to take a while, and I know it's nights and weekends, but I need you to call everyone on LinkedIn who's ever worked for Clayton. You know, and that's like 40,000 people. They're like, okay, I'll try. And you know, in the course of that, somebody tweeted our first story and said she loved it and she worked at Clayton, and that was absolutely true, everything that we wrote. She turned out to be a real key, because that was the person who went on the record and talked about the kind of racial language that was being used in the collections rooms and the ways in which these things were connected in terms of the incentive structure, and who gave me list upon list of names of people who mostly slammed the door in my face, but here and there were a few who actually were willing to talk. You know, being from Appalachia myself and sort of knowing the manner and knowing the language helped. So does bringing people cookies. You know, I mean, I don't think showing up at the door empty-handed is the right thing to do. I don't believe in giving gifts to sources either. So something you can make yourself, like cookies, is a great idea if you're dealing with people in, you know, in rural Appalachia who might not trust you. So there are all these sort of things that we picked up along the way, but I think the overarching lesson was sometimes when you think you've tried everything and you think you're done, you have not quite brute forced it all the way. Sometimes if you can get that editor to give you that extra month or those extra couple of weekends, something might open up to you that just brings your story to a whole other level that you couldn't have even imagined.
That's great. This has been great. I could ask you another 15 questions, but we're almost out of time, so let me open it up if anybody out here has a question. Hey, Kristen. Yeah. There's a mic somewhere. Greg, sorry, do you have the mic, Greg? Thank you. Okay, yeah. Just ask it loudly.
So I'm studying at University of Georgia. I'm in a common law class this semester. We kind of talk about arbitration a lot. But when you're doing a kind of investigative piece, you know you're going to get a lot of pushback for who you're reporting against. How do you, as you're reporting, kind of guard yourself against any kind of future legal pushback?
You mean being sued?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, I can. So I think it's important, like what Jonathan was saying, of testing your own hypothesis all the time, because you need to assume that you're wrong, and you need to poke holes in your own story the way that anyone who was going to try to go after you would do, right? So my kind of imagined adversary is the Chamber of Commerce. So I was like, okay, so if I'm the Chamber of Commerce, because they've been huge supporters of arbitration, what would I say about this story? And if you keep on kind of poking holes and making sure that there's no weaknesses that they could go through, I think I felt protected in that way. And then the no surprises thing. I think that's crucial. I think that even if everything is right, even if there are no errors and everything is bulletproof, as the people say in the newsroom, right? If you have surprised someone and they think the story was going to be something else, or they think it was going to be a positive story and it's a negative one, or they thought it was going to be a negative story and it's a positive one, or they feature in it more than you've let them know, I think that's where you really open yourself up to legal challenges. I think. I mean, these guys would know just as well as I do.
So I found the vetting experience at BuzzFeed just orders of magnitude more intense than anything I'd experienced before on this Buffett story for a variety of reasons. One, we know that Berkshire Hathaway is litigious against journalists, and we know they hire Boyce Schiller. Now, fortunately, we also have a phenomenal in-house litigation counsel who has litigated against Boyce Schiller on behalf of, your employer and others. And she...
Theranos?
Yeah, I mean, Theranos also used Boyce Schiller, yes. Yeah. So, we were thinking actually at every single stage about legal implications. And there were things, was like, well, what did you say to that source? And what did he say to you? And under what circumstances? And where were you? And could it possibly, had he been recording you, could it be used to prove malicious intent? Did you jump on board with something critical that he had said? And so it was not just within the text of the story, which was absolutely lawyered to within an inch of its life, but it was before that even happened, was the process pristine? Was it sufficiently pristine that we had all of our defenses and all of our ramparts in place? And, it was surprisingly not limiting. I had expected that thinking in that way would prevent you from saying certain things that you wanted to say. But actually what it really did was helped us to do the other kind of bulletproofing, which is the factual bulletproofing and the fairness bulletproofing. I really felt we gained an enormous amount from worrying ourselves about legal liability.
Okay, that's great. Other questions? Here, and then one back there. Yeah.
James Medora, I write about the economy for Newsday. Congratulations to each of you on your work. Talk about the early process before you're pitching the story to your editor, because your editor doesn't want you going down a rabbit hole. So what test do you use to determine, hey, I've got a story here. I'm now going to go to my editor. I'm going to say I'm going to need some time to work on it.
Okay, so I have like a million stories floating in my head at all times, right? And the challenge is to like put meat on the bone, to find ideas that are actually going to work. And so that's why I was saying earlier, I'm like, trying to like pore over reports and analyses and look at data, because I'm looking for stuff that is really going to stand out. And I'm looking for those characters or those specific examples that are going to be so compelling that when I go to my editor, they're going to be like, drop everything and do it. No, they don't say that. That never happens. But they're going to be excited, like I am, right? And so it's this sort of like struggle for me to find those specific instances. And I have a pretty high bar. I mean, we were hearing, I think we all have been talking about how important it is to be really ambitious, to want to do stuff that's really big, right? You don't want to take like flimsy incremental news and try and stretch it beyond where it can go. It's just going to burst. So the key is to like find stuff that is truly ambitious. Yeah, how does a company price its drug? That is a story that anybody's going to want to read. If I said that to my mom, she'd be like, yeah, I want to read that right now, right? So if you sort of meet that test, I think your editor will go along.
Okay. That was the question back there. Someone back
on
there?
a related note, there was a story recently that a Mother Jones investigative project about private prisons.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
There was a story recently about a Mother Jones investigative project about private prisons that cost about $350,000 to fully report out and publish. It generated about $5,000 in banner ads. So I'm wondering if you have ever faced the business pressures to justify an investigative project, and how you juggle the requirements of really investigating a story out fully with the needs to feed the beast and appease your editors and some of those other costs or cost pressures. And I'm wondering if you think that there's, given the Mother Jones thing, for example, if the future of investigative journalism depends on new business models or other ways of funding these kinds of investigations.
From my perspective, and I've worked at a wire service and a tabloid newspaper and a nonprofit before BuzzFeed, this is an issue that evolves over the course of your career. I think if you're young and starting out and you want to do investigations, James Medora can tell you, sometimes you have to stomp your feet and jump up and down and alienate a bunch of people in order to get 5 minutes to do one. And that is, at the beginning. But once you start to prove your chops and gain the respect of people and get into a position where the expectation is that you will be writing large and ambitious things, you tend to be fairly insulated. Now, the nonprofit situation was unique and particularly instructive in this because there was a very sort of one-to-one correlation between the money coming in from the Ford Foundation or whomever and the work that we were able to do. And it was very clear, I wanted to spend a year on this, but the Ford Foundation expected 5 stories that year, and so that was what it was going to be. Working at BuzzFeed, venture capital is a very helpful thing to have. I don't understand how it works all that well, but it seems like there is an institutional commitment to produce this level of journalism that is separate from the sort of P&Ls and cash flows of the broader newsroom. And I think that if you have that kind of support from the top, that's really where you're going to find the space to do this stuff, because that is not unusual what happened to Mother Jones. If you were able to do cost outs of any of our projects, I think you'd see something very similar.
But there's another balance too, which is less financial, although like that's something that we have to deal with all the time. But like Jonathan, when you were talking about how you've been covering the pharmaceutical industry for 8 years, 10 years, however long you've been doing it, I think there's an interesting balance that I struggle with a lot, which is like, how do you do these deep investigative stories and have the ideas to do them if you are not covering a beat? Like, so, you know, I think that the only reason I could do the arbitration stories was because I kind of knew that they were, like, it kind of goes back, James, to your question, like, how do you know when something, like, how do you know when it's a big story? And I think if you've been on a beat, I knew enough to be like, oh, okay, so this is not just like a bunch of crazy people calling me, like my mother's friends, calling me with like a tip. It's true, Mom. But you know, so I do think it's a challenge if you're trying to cover a beat and also dive in and do a project. I think it's really important to have a beat.
Yeah.
But I also think that can also take time away from being able to dive in. So I don't know what the answer is at all.
I mean, I want to add one more thing to which is absolutely an excellent point and something I'm struggling with now because I'm for the first time in a pure investigations role without a clear beat assignment. But I think also the thing that comes into play that is not this direct financial pressure is opportunity cost. It's, you know, you are a well-resourced reporter. You are being given, you know, often the strongest editors and often, you know, the best sort of space to do what you want to do. But how much time is it worth spending on this thing versus developing your next story, versus moving on to the next thing? And I struggle, as I know many of my colleagues do, with how to keep those irons in the fire while you're really completely obsessed and focused on this one giant thing. And I don't think I figured it out. But I think that what's been useful is to think harder about what am I not doing if I'm doing this? And is there a tipping point at which it would have been better to spend some time on these other things? I think that's the sort of balance that comes into play in, you know, in the sort of pure investigations role that was not there in more of a news role.
Yeah, I think you know, I actually would love to go on these incredibly interesting points, but unfortunately we're out of time. So thank you all very much. It's been great, really, really interesting discussion. Thank you.
For those of you in the audience, stay put. Data visualization is going to slide right in, and we're going to get right into data visualization.